So thank you everybody for joining us. Today's talk is actually something that's been a labor of love. I've been working on it for years, and it really started in collaboration with organizers from TEDx Calgary and TEDx York. And I want to give a shout out to them and thanking CIHR for their funding, which helped make this possible through a Pain and Child Health Strategic Training Grant that they specifically had to increase training. So the talk today is really dedicated to researchers and scientists who have very complex messages that we want to learn and pick up some tips about how to communicate that message. So this isn't going to be a talk about basic public speaking. I think anybody who'd be watching this video would have experience in public speaking, but it's really about that idea of trying to get past just having an amazing idea and being able to communicate that idea to people who don't have the same research and scientific background that you would coming into it. So the first goal is to inspire you to inspire. So as I'm giving a talk on talking, or giving a talk, I'm trying to actually hold true to my principles. And so I wanted to just start with a story. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember, but this was a very staple of my childhood. It was a station wagon, and the kind of resembled the station wagon that I had growing up. And the reason I bring it up is because one of the memories that makes me laugh and is a defining memory of myself is driving with my father. It was probably 7 a.m. I was someone who was always involved in student council or doing all sorts of crazy stuff that he had to wake up early and take me places. And he said to me, "Okay, Rebecca, no talking, just let me listen to the radio." And I bring up that story because it's about how I've always been a verbal person, how I've always loved to talk. And it was something I did in high school competitively, something I did in university with debate teams and things like that, and something I felt very comfortable about. And then I became a formal scientist, I feel, like a researcher, and who had a professor gig and started having to give a lot more talks, a lot more presentations in front of classrooms, in front of students. And my message got more complicated. The more research I did, the more that my ideas evolved. And what I found is that in the increasing sophistication and certainty and excitement with the work that I was building in my research program, the less time I was spending giving talks. So the complexity increased, but I kept spending less and less time. And I'm infamous in my lab of once finishing a talk on the escalator down into the room that I was going to be presenting. So the idea of the last minute talk, the busy academic, completely understand that. And so taking an approach and working with TEDx, I had this experience. And so I got accepted into the TEDx program at York. And it was a very humbling experience for me. So I was asked to give a 9-minute talk, which I thought was a ridiculous amount of time to do something to communicate. And I was actually being coached by an undergraduate student who was fluent in TEDx methodologies. And so here I was, I think at the time I was an associate professor. I had this huge program, multi-million-dollar program of research, and I was being coached by an undergraduate. And it was a humbling and important experience for me because it really was one of those moments in my career where it took my practices from that point shifted. So a lot of the lessons that I learned in terms of being able to give a TEDx presentation that I think went reasonably well. It's online somewhere if you Google TEDx and my name. But I think that what it really taught me and changed how I approached giving my talks from that point on, whether it was for a lay audience, like something that TEDx tends to focus on, or I actually use them as a scientist as well when I'm giving talks, because I think that the same principles are important and we forget that. I think that, or at least when I was approaching my talks, I'm like, well, they understand this, they'll get this, and this is the key points. And so I didn't spend a lot of time on the actual shaping of the presentation and how I delivered the message. To me, what was most important was this particular set of research findings. And so what you learn, though, is that isn't what I've learned, in my opinion, is that that's not the most important part. I think the message is the core, but how you deliver that message will actually dictate whether that message gets heard. So you can give the message, but whether that message will go anywhere is actually whether or not it's actually heard. So I'm hoping you'll see some tips here that you can take forward. And now at this point in the game, I feel like it's second nature, and it actually makes me a more efficient and I think more capable speaker. And so I'm hoping that I can share some of those tips with you. So I think that Einstein said this. There's some debate about it, but the idea is that with our complex ideas, if you can't explain it simply, If you can't get to the essence of the thought, you actually don't understand it well enough. And I'll give you some examples. I want to give you a clear example of how I made that mistake. But this idea of simplicity to get the same message across is critical. And it requires a deeper level of processing. So I laugh because the example that I will be giving you is something that was a product of, I'd say, about 8 years of in-depth analysis. The teams of hundreds contributed to this, over 100, sorry, contributed to this work. And yet I didn't understand it well enough until I got to the point where I could actually communicate it to a lay audience, because it was the essence of how my message, my research was going to impact society. But, and I'm a baby researcher, so I have to have a picture of a baby, even if it's tokenistic, but this idea of how to take a complex message, a message that you've worked so hard on, invested hundreds and thousands of hours in, and people time into, how do you make that simple? And how do you get that message communicated? So this is core TEDx, I think, principles, this idea of a talk that must be novel, emotional, and memorable. And I think as scientists, we're really good, or as scholars, we are really good about the idea of novelty. We get that to get funded, to get something published, there has to be a new or novel angle to that. However, where I think we start fittering off or not paying as much attention to is the idea that our talk, for our message to get across to other human beings, actually has to have some sort of emotional valence or component to it. Because if it doesn't, it won't be memorable. So this is the way humans process information, and whether that human is a scientist or your aunt listening in to a TED Talk that you're doing, the idea is that this emotional and memorable aspect of your talk has to be there. And so I think as we go forward, I just offer this thought to when you're putting together your talk and thinking about your strategies. I have to give so many talks a week. This is my third talk actually this week. And being facile and quick to be able to get your message out there, I think, is critical. But an important piece is to self-reflect about what annoys you when you're in an audience. So while we're not going to discuss it here, and I have a workshop version of this talk, but I think the idea is to really process what causes you to shut out of a talk. What causes you to start checking your email? What causes you to kind of let your mind wander? And when you're in a talk that you don't like, that to have that self-reflection as you're listening to others speak and creating your own talks, so that you can try to avoid those pitfalls when you're giving talks. So it's just a moment of, while I'm going to give you some tips that I've learned from TEDx and my own experiences, I think the real idea too is that to make this common practice, to internalize it a little bit, to think about what makes you check your email during a talk. So the next step, so hopefully that's inspired you about why this would be important. I think that how we do that is the next step, and kind of moving into some tips. So another key idea of TEDx and some of the methodologies with TED that they teach you is they talk about a through line. And so the reason I put this clothesline image out here is because to me that's what the through line really is. It's a sentence, or a very succinct way that summarizes the point of why you're giving the talk. And then the clothesline idea is that all your slides must clip on to that through line. And so sometimes a key mistake that people make when giving research talks, I feel, is that they'll give studies that are not necessarily all related to one central theme. And this tight theme is critical for your message to be memorable. So I get that many times we present study upon study upon study, different research, different pieces. But the idea is that all of the information you present in a talk should have a through line, a central theme, central sentence that you can isolate about why that particular idea is relevant and should be clipped onto your through line of your talk. So the activity that they make you do, and I would highly recommend it, I still do this, I don't necessarily write it out, but before I start a talk, especially a talk brand new from scratch, but also not, because when you're stealing slides from other presentations, so again, this talk is more for people who give talks all the time, and you're stealing slides. Before you steal a slide from another talk for this new talk that you're going to be recreating, think about what is the main point of your talk. And what TED, one of the procedures that they teach you to do is to define your through line in 15 words or less. The minute you start going on to multiple sentences, multiple clauses, all of that stuff, you're losing the idea of how to communicate a clear message. And again, it's that idea of trying to get at the essence of why they should care and what is the idea that you want them to leave with. So for example, for this talk that I'm giving today, my job, I thought, is to provide a clear justification and clear techniques to your researchers to inspire more impactful talks. So I want you to think that it's important, and I also want you to know how and to give you some tips about how to actually do that. So I think that when I start a talk, and I literally, I just had this thought process, it actually helps me work quicker. Because now when I have that key point of where I want, what I want the take-home message, what I want the actual purpose of my talk to be, it really helps me kind of figure out which slides I can reuse and which slides I have to recreate. And then I really do think about how do these, each slide that I'm adding, how does this add on to the main point of why I'm giving this talk? So a key technique, and I gave you an example when I started, is to tell a story. So, you know, when you read books about TED, they talk about this idea of the evolutionary history of humanity and at the beginning in oral traditions. And oral traditions being our way of understanding and the importance of being able to tell a good story. Now, before there was written word, it was this idea that all of our ideas were transmitted orally. And so the idea of something being memorable was critical to the survival of society at that point in time. And so this idea about bringing it now into the modern age is that we have to tell a story. And so when you're thinking about your through line, so again, it anchors back into the through line. You want to think about what inspired you, what went wrong before it went right. So things that people will find engaging, amusing, enduring, being frustrated, what inspired you. So stories that kind of talk about how amazing you were and how awesome your research program is, and what a fantastic moment you went from, you know, idea conceptualization to mobilization, isn't the way to go. I think the idea is to try and give a more human narrative, and that can be encapsulated quickly. So when you're thinking about talks, and I actually do use this with research in scientific talks as well, I try and start with or somewhere in the middle, and sometimes I will embed multiple stories in. I think about stories and anecdotes that contextualize my research idea and my results. And the story shouldn't be long. We're thinking about a minute or less. And I pick my stories based on the central through line. So again, you'll see I keep bringing up this through line, but it's really that idea of everything has to hook on to have a coherent message. Because at the end of the day, even if you're delivering, you know, 5 slides, chances are people are going to only walk away with one idea. And so reinforcing that message over and over again through different paths and different ways, and this is one of the strategies, giving a narrative, is important. And most likely the narrative, the stories that you share, will be the most important, most memorable. So making sure that it links to your through line and your purpose of your talk is critical. It can be a personal story, so something I shared from childhood was how I chose to start this talk, but it can also be a story about your research or your professional life. You don't want to be too detailed or actually too personal, but you want to get the essence of the context that you need to communicate. So with short stories, you really have to think about the story and craft it a little bit, because you can't tell everything. Like I didn't talk about where we were driving when I told you my story this morning. I didn't talk about the history of my talking or go into details about how much I debated or did these sorts of, or did public speaking contests. So what I did is picked up the essence that you needed to know to get the point across that I love to talk, and even someone who was very comfortable and competed, let's say, and did training in that way, actually needed to do a phase shift to understand better ways to communicate, particularly where in a digital age, where short talks, 2-minute clips, clickbait, you know, this sort of social media world is integral to altmetrics, which is a key a key metric for researchers to look at how much they've penetrated. So we're really moving past just being able to communicate to other scholars, but actually being able to communicate to society as a whole. You want to ensure that the anecdote that you share, it has some sort of strong emotion, that me using that image of the station wagon for people who are that old or who are watching, I made a joke earlier about Stranger Things, who watch that TV show, you know, who see these idea of an old car that you don't see around right now. And something that, you know, I tend to go laughter. I've seen talks very skillfully use sadness, anger, empathy, but there's an emotional component to it that will allow it to stick. And then it always ends with a link to the purpose of the talk. So again, that through line again, it's not just about endearing the audience to you, but endearing the audience to your message. So another quote that I think was very influential in my training when I was learning and reading up about this methodology of presenting was the idea that it's really been shown that knowledge can't be pushed into a brain. It must be pulled in. And what that really means is this idea that you need to think of techniques that make people want to remember what you're saying. So you can present, but it's not necessarily they will remember or retain, or, you know, in academia too, we want to be cited, we want to be acknowledged, we want our ideas to influence other scientists, or we want our message to include, you know, societal practice or life. And so you want them to not just listen or hear it, but to listen and actually actively want to. And so some of the research is actually from neuroscience research about what are strategies that make people want to hear your message, to give messages that people want to hear. And smiling is one of those key things. So a neutral face makes it more difficult for people to actually want to engage and cause people to turn away. Where people, when you smile, it causes more facial engagement, and more facial engagement means more connection. More connection means your message is getting through. You want to vary your tone to connect and to engage. So this is this really idea of like sometimes speaking very slowly to get a message across in a tone that's laughing, serious, varying tone throughout that to help engage your audience. Because if it's all monotonous and you're presenting like this, which is professional and often what we see in scientific conferences, you realize that the speakers who are more engaging and more variable in their tone and pace tend to be ones that get higher ratings in audience satisfaction. Another key piece is to try and connect with your audience. So this is very hard. Obviously, I'm connecting right now with a camera and not a face. But the idea of connecting and making eye contact is important. First, it gets people's attention. So when you make eye contact, it actually, in a classroom or in a research situation, the idea that you are making eye contact brings people back in. So it's natural for our mind to wander. That's a natural part of listening and hearing. But the idea that you want to make eye contact will bring people back in. It also, and this is an important tip for advanced speakers, is it allows you to read your audience to give feedback. So I think this is a critical piece I also see scientists and scholars missing a lot of the time, is that they're not actually connecting using eye contact with the audience to see, are people bored? Are people not understanding? Do you see quizzical looks? Because the best teachers, and I see this a lot in teaching, the best teachers are actually scanning the audience and looking for messaging back, feedback, to kind of read what is happening. The other thing to truly understand that I see that, and again, I will show you, I'm coming as a convert, but someone who, despite a lot of experience, made a lot of mistakes and still continue to learn as I process, is that speaking is not writing and listening is not reading. So yes, of course, no doubt, right? This is not shocking, but what you find is that scientists and scholars, researchers tend to try, when they're not getting their message across effectively, to try and provide so much detail as they would in a book chapter or a paper or some sort of written exposition. And the idea is that when you speak, you cannot provide that level of detail. We're depending on working memory. So again, the psychologist, neuroscientist aspect that influences me so deeply is this idea of understanding that when you're reading, you can go back up and kind of people don't have to depend on their memory to process a topic or a theme or an idea. However, when you're speaking, listeners, audience does not have that same opportunity to kind of go back and say, wait, what was that? They actually have to keep this all in their working memory, which is limited capacity. So this is that other idea about detail and getting to the essence of comments and thinking about the simplest way to communicate a message. When you're talking to other scientists, I think the idea is for them is to inspire them to be so interested by your work that they'll look up the written version or the video version or the more extended version of what you're doing, rather than being able to communicate all the details. You want to inspire them to want more. And so this is that idea that you're not going to get it all out, stop trying. And so I think one of my humbling moments when preparing my own TEDx talk is that I had created, an outline, I had done the through line, and then when I met with my coach, the idea of what I was going to communicate, I ended up using about 10% of the content. And every comment that I wanted to make or every story I wanted to tell ended up getting isolated to literally a few sentences in a sharp, consistent, coherent talk. And I do think that my TED Talk was a really good experience because it was also an ability for me to get things down to its essence and quickly communicate it to other people, as opposed to having people wanting to sit through a longer talk that we're used to giving. If we're teaching, it can be up to 3 hours. If we're giving a talk or a workshop, anywhere between 30 minutes and 50 minutes. But we still struggle because we know that the work that we do is complicated. And so again, it's this idea of how do we go from these complex ideas. We sometimes, with our PhD, we've spent 5-7 years on projects that come to this fruition, and the details are important to us. And sometimes the detail is why it is so important to our field, that we've gone into this detail, we've disaggregated something that's really important. But when we're communicating to lay audiences and to scientists, we have to learn to get to the essence. And your message will be heard better. And that's the challenge that, you have to change my mind, and I don't think I'll be changed again, is that the simpler the message, the more you spend on crafting the essence of your work, the more your work is going to be heard. And so one of the things I give to scientists is some of the ideas of when you're presenting complex graphs and tables and other sorts of ways of conceptualizing data. So the first thing to do is to have an informative title. So I'm a sinner, I do this all the time, but I'll sometimes just clip an image, a table or a figure from a journal article and post it in. But that title is great within a manuscript, but it's not great within a talk. So the key piece is to have a very short but informative title on your data slides. So the idea that whenever you're having a slide, to have a title that explains what the main point of it is in a short way, because when an audience listens, that's what they're going to see first. That's what they're going to be drawn towards, is this title. And so giving them that meta structure, that bigger overall piece that describes all the mini pieces within, will help them understand your message. You also want to orient to the take-home message first. So the reason I'm showing you this table is, the reason I'm showing you this figure is. So in a line or two, just tell them why, what's the purpose. And you should know the purpose, because data slides are hard to comprehend, can often be hard to comprehend. And so you really want to figure out, why am I including this, and share it with the audience so that they can actually take that take-home message with them about why you thought it was important to show a data figure. You always want to explain axes or rows. So when you're showing figures, orient them to the x-axis, the y-axis, or what the rows and the columns represent. Or if you're doing a circle graph, what the components are going to represent. If you don't do that, then they're going to be struggling. And when they're struggling, they're not hearing you. They're listening. Their ears are working, or sorry, they're listening but not hearing. But this idea that they're not processing what you're presenting because you're trying to still orient. Break down images or data pieces of your figure or into smaller pieces so that you can talk them through it in a systematic way. Another thing that scientists often do is they apologize about the font size. So they'll say something like, oh, you probably can't see these numbers in the table, but blah, 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 blah. If you have to apologize that the font size in your figure or your table are too small, change it. Don't do it. Don't use it. This idea of how to create slides, I'll go on to, but the idea about apologizing for font size. It doesn't happen when you do talks well. When you're doing talks well, you're not apologizing about a visual aid that's for them. If they can't see it and they can't read it, you shouldn't be using it. And then the jargon check, I think this is something I often get lost in, is that we have variable names that are from our data sets as opposed to what we use, what they actually are or what they mean. And so even using a measure name or using some of our language that we've worked so hard to conceptualize in a variable label or a title for something, a construct that we use, be really careful about using it. Very often, when you use jargon, there's probably a very, very small percentage of people on this planet that will actually understand that. And so those are people who are deepest in your research groups or your labs, and so, or your key core collaborators, or, and so you're actually presenting, most often the talks that I'm talking about are where you want to break free from just your small little nuclear group, but you're actually wanting to communicate some of your ideas to a larger audience, so there'll be uptake, impact. So this is one of my sins. I want to share that this was a project. It was based on the largest data set in the world. I was very proud of it. It took 7 years of data collection. It was longitudinal. We followed 760 families over the first 5 years of life. We had a lot to say about what ultimately predicted children who were scared of vaccination needles. And so this is a slide I literally used. It was one of the first. It was our first in the preschool. I was proud. It was cited in the New York Times. The graduate student, Nicole Racine, who had done this study, had won the Governor General's Award for York for this. This was something I was very proud of. So the details, the complication was so important to me because we had worked so hard to get it. But that didn't make my message any easier. And I think it got lost. The message got lost. So, I got better over time. You give this talk a couple times and I changed the title. So now you kind of know I was trying to predict child anticipatory distress from infant and preschool variables. You didn't really know the pain was there, but if this idea that this was happening. I tried to use animations in another rendition of the talk where I was breaking it down piece by piece to try and talk them through about, yes, these aspects of infant functioning or infant and caregiver behavior during the 12-month vaccination or the 2-month vaccination was predicting preschool, these sorts of things to take them through. And then, with all the things that I learned that I would flip that model. There was a lot of the structural equation modeling that kind of went into it. I'd flip it up for a second, but this is where I'd speak from. Ultimately, I took that complication, something that took 7 years, that has resulted in many papers since then, but I actually ultimately isolated it down to the message. Preschooler, prenatal distress is most powerful predictor, parent behavior. Parents predict what are happening to children's distress prior to a vaccination, right? And so ultimately it's the emotion as you see a child and a mother, there's a healthcare professional getting the child ready for the vaccination, but ultimately the message I wanted to say is that, hey, parents are powerful. Parents impact how scared a child is before that needle, and they're the most common predictor. There was a whole bunch of complexity as to, all the things that we ruled out to say that why parent was the most powerful, and got down to this image. And this image and this kind of conceptualization is what helped me deal with the media. It helped me deal with giving and communicating messages and the importance of my work. So switching gears a bit, I think that this is a given for many, but I want to say it just to make sure that even for professional speakers, that it's important to actually practice your talk out loud. So I know people who will, and I know because I was one of them, who would actually go through slides and not actually practice the act of speaking out loud. So thinking about what you're going to say and saying what you're going to say are completely different activities. I know on the surface that's very easy to kind of recognize, but actually in terms of the polish of your presentation style, you want to be able to say your story. You don't want to hum and haw and those sorts of things, where a little bit is okay. We always have to pause for thought. But you want to get into habits of that you're practicing out loud, and even video recording yourself. And now it's easier than ever to video record your talk, to look at how you present, how your verbal behaviors and your nonverbal behaviors. And doing that out loud will help you vary your tone, help you be able to not do as many distracting behaviors, and help you actually have a clear message. So it's about the delivery. So practicing out loud helps you create the language then that you can then present. So as a reminder, and I think we all, and I'm as guilty as the rest, to reminding ourselves about slides and who they're for. So slides are actually not for you. You should really see slides as for your audience. And so when I'm training my undergraduates in my lab about how to give presentations and talks about journal club or whatever, and even my early graduate students, the idea of teaching them that the slides actually have to be something for someone else, not as a memory aid for you. And so the idea of having slides, and if you need notes, I'm someone who tends not to work from notes, but if you're someone who needs the notes, you need notes separate to that. Your slides should be a visual aid that will help communicate your message. Visual images are extremely powerful, and the images you choose will help verify your message and allow you to say your message in fewer words. So the idea of taking a look at your slides, this is one version of my talk, but the idea of being able to look at your slide sorter and using that to look at just from visually, are there ones that are just too text heavy? Are there ones that aren't balanced right, that don't look right? Have I varied the types of messages, the type of images that I want to use? So this idea of taking a vision, who cares about the content? Like at this point, we're kind of getting away from the content, but we're talking about a method about how to communicate that messaging. And so taking your slide sorter to take a look about simple messages that are communicating the ideas that you want to communicate in very succinct and efficient ways so that your message can be heard. So some side tips. They talk about making sure you never have more than 6 bullets and 6 words. I know that even that people would say is a lot. I try and avoid that whenever possible. People have brought up when I've given this talk in other places, well, when you teach, you can't do these sorts of things. And so I really want to communicate that in teaching, this may not be the best model, but I think a lot of these principles still play in. But I think with slides and when you're teaching and students have to take notes, it's a bit of a different thing. But the idea here is when you're really trying to communicate a message to an audience in a very efficient way, and often where you're not being tested on the details. And so the 6 bullets, 6 words, avoid, and this is a TED term, sligements. So there are people who will like just put paragraphs of text, paragraphs and paragraphs. And it's really just a document, a Word document that you've put into PowerPoint. And so that's not the way to go. You really want to be able to, and again, that clean images, limited text, and only using text when you really have to, and thinking about that the slides are not for you. The slides are for your audience to communicate and underpin the messaging that you're making so that you can do this in a less wordy way. That comment about, I'm not sure you can read this. And if you find yourself saying that about any type of slide, even if it's not a data slide, or maybe that text is too small for you to read and you find yourself apologizing to the audience, cut it. You shouldn't be doing that. Again, slides are not for you, slides are for your audience, and having too much text, they're going to be trying to read, they're going to be trying to hear you, and being able to listen and process, and so that won't happen. Friends don't let friends use clip art. So the idea of using just little clip art images and things is a very old style of presenting. I just learned that. I was doing it up until, but apparently that's with visual images being so readily available. I will invest in going to Shutterstock or going to image sites to actually purchase for high impact talks. So I spent, I think, $300 or $400 on images for my Royal Society talk. I knew I was going up. It was a high impact audience. And so I spent the money to make sure that I could have beautiful, big, full slide talks that aren't blurred with the visual images and taking myself through. Use image consistency. So flopping between too many types of black and white and color and things like that. Make sure that within a slide, you actually keep very consistent. So making sure that you don't have too busy slides that have clip art and photos and images and cartoons, but rather trying to stay consistent within a slide. And use videos judiciously. There are times when videos can say something much more poignantly than you ever could. But sometimes people overuse videos in these types of talks. Make sure you get the essence of what's talking, and make sure that you're not just really having someone else say what you should be saying, because ultimately you communicating that message clearly will probably be the best way of doing that, with using a video very judiciously to showcase something again, because a picture or a video can be worth 1,000 words. I give this talk fully recognizing that there are people out there, scientists and scholars, who did not get out and did not pursue their passion in order to publicly talk about it all the time, and they may actually hate public speaking. And so I have to say that it's an important thing to expose yourself to and get over it. It's important. This is an important skill. I would argue that it's almost as important as your ability to write as a scientist, because your messaging, being able to broaden the impact of the research, the important work you do, is being able to actually get it down to 1-minute snippets, 2-minute snippets, 9-minute snippets, and then full range talks, and then lectures. And so being able to orally communicate, it's an important way of communication. It's an important way society absorbs information. And so getting used to public speaking by exposing yourself is important. I talk about the power of vulnerability because giving perfect talks where it is actually not the best way to go. I had mentioned, so some ahs actually draw people in again. It gets their attention back because there's a pause in a kind of, it can be a monotonous kind of stream of speaking. And so that idea of the power of vulnerability to actually bring people in. And also when you make a mistake, if you flub on a slide or you're giving a presentation, to say, wait, sorry, I made a mistake here. Let me try that again. And not to be scared of that. That actually, again, is being able to acknowledge that gets people's attention back. So you may have been saying something, people may have been drifting, you made a mistake, and then everybody's like, wait, what was the mistake? And then listening in again. So you can actually use the mistakes because there's a power in the vulnerability of that. Another aspect with hating public speaking is, being in front and seeing all of these faces. So I think this is an old school trick. I think there's nothing novel about this, but the idea of actually focusing on a few different people in the audience and your audience friends. So if you don't want to focus on everybody, I think it's more important to focus on a few people scattered within the audience, because you don't want to just focus on one side. So finding one person in each section that you feel comfortable, that is giving you good feedback, that you can actually talk. Now, I know people say, well, just picture everybody in their underwear when you give a talk or something like that. That would make me more nervous. So I've never understood that comment, but why you would want to do that. I just wouldn't want to be in that room. So I think finding audience friends are a better way of facing your audience. So that way you're really isolating a large audience to just a few people, and even planting people. I've had graduate students or undergraduates planting people throughout in a conference when they gave their first talk or their first presentation in a larger group, so that there were people across so they could still scan the audience, because you want to try and still have that appearance that you're connecting. And when you get more comfortable, you will be able to connect through eye contact and use the audience to give feedback. But until you feel that, and if you are someone who really hates public speaking, using those tips to work your way up after exposing yourself to opportunities in smaller groups, such as your research group, your spouse, someone like that, your kids, trying to give you a talk and getting bigger and bigger. So I'm hoping that there's going to be a cycle. You're going to be inspired to give bigger talks, and that is going to cause others, with your sharing the amazing research you're going to be sharing. York has such a diverse amount of research. It's the best part of being associate vice president is getting exposed to research beyond my research group, my department, my faculty, and getting to see the amazingness. And so I'm hoping you will use some of these tips to help inspire others, and that this will have a cycle of how our research can have greater impact by inspiring others to change based on the great work we do. Here are some references that were integral to what I put in some of these ideas in the methodology. And Ross McMillan and Jonathan Perkins were the two individuals that really helped, and that the funding came from CIHR through a Pain and Child Health Global Research Training Grant. Thank you, everybody.